Hi, everybody. Welcome to week 12. This week we're going to be looking at concept art, performance, and earth art, or sometimes called earthworks. This is art that emerges in the 1960s. At the by the time we get to the early 1960s, um, a number of movements are overlapping. So rather than look at it as if pop art and minimalism come and go, and then these particular movements emerge, what's really happening is that we have lots and lots of different languages for art emerging in the 1960s. We'll talk about that a little bit more in a second, but I want to just do a little bit of housekeeping first and introduce you to what we'll be looking at this week and what your responsibilities are. And then I have a few more things to say about the content for this week. All right, so you need to read chapter 17 in Gompertz and look at the two videos, the video lectures this week. One is about 30 minutes, the other one's about 12 minutes. They do a good job breaking down conceptual art, performance, and earthworks over those two videos. And then there's a number of very short films, video clips really, that you want to look at in order to get a sense of the kind of work that was being done at the time, particularly with regard to performance art. This week, there's a journal entry that there is no quiz this week. The journal, I'm going to go down here and just read you the prompt for that. The idea is to choose a performance piece discussed in this week's lecture or text reading. Write a brief description of 2 or 3 sentences, and don't forget to include the artist, the title, and the year it was created. There are several videos embedded here for you to use, as I describe above in the introduction. The idea is to write a brief critique of the work using the knowledge base that you have developed in the course. Your job is to analyze it and relate it to your own experiences. So in other words, you get to be an art critic this week. Think about the fact that good criticism is always going to do more than just say, I like it or I don't like it. You need to say why something works or doesn't work, why it fits the characteristics of a particular movement, why it might be compelling, why it might have social significance or historical significance. So think hard on this and take this seriously, that a good criticism is good analysis, right? Where the work is broken down, where it's explained, and where the critic tries to interpret that work. Some things to consider. What is the artist's intention? Is the work successful? How does the viewer connect to the work? How might this work have impact or a connection to your own personal experiences? So have fun with that. So a number of videos that you'll watch this week. One is Andy Goldsworthy working. Andy Goldsworthy is an artist who is later than the traditional earthworks artist you're going to look at in the 60s. His work is really about engagement with nature in a very interesting way. I would say he is the most, no pun intended, down to earth of all the artists that you're looking at today. His work is probably the most accessible. So you'll see that by the time this type of more conceptual, more land-based art reaches the 1980s, it has perhaps become a little more accessible to people. There is a short documentary of John Baldessari's life, which is narrated by musician Tom Waits. Be sure to look at that. Bruce Naumann's piece, Dancer Exercise, which is really interesting with regard to the way the body is used rhythmically in a piece. Chris Burden's Shoot, which you'll see what happens in that one. I'm not going to say too much about that. And then here is Marina Abramovic, who is a very well-known performance artist who's been around for decades. So there's a piece, Rhythm O, which is very striking and very disturbing. I think you'll see why. And then a documentary um, with Marina Abramovic and Ulay, her main collaborator, for about a period of about 15 years. And then there's a Bruce Nauman film called Pinch Neck, a piece Yoko Ono did in 1964 called Cut Piece. Um, Yoko Ono, of course, is the widow of John Lennon. She's a performance artist. And then the two lecture clips on earthworks or earth art and conceptual art. So, what do I want to say just as a kind of a quick introduction to this week? It seems that every time we get to a place where it's hard to believe art could get any more challenging or any more anti-establishment, it seems that the bar is raised. And I think that's what happens this week. We're going to see artists who go even further than, say, Andy Warhol, right, or the pop artists, in sort of sticking their finger in the eye of convention. These artists are very much drawn to Dada and the experiments of the original Dadaists. They are engaged in what might be called neo-Dada in terms of breaking disciplinary boundaries, working across visual art, performance, and music. They are really deeply engaged in collapsing the boundary between high art and life. And that's probably the most important thing I can say this week that hasn't been said elsewhere, is that there's a real drive to move beyond the modernist idea that art should be kind of an elevation of the emotions and the spirit, and it should stand apart from everyday experience, right? It should be something we seek out to elevate ourselves. And instead, the artists today are saying, how can we reintegrate art back into life? How can art be almost fully integrated or fully reflective of everyday experience? And I think, as you'll see, it's very hard to look at this work and say, oh, I understand that, I get that. Understanding is very personal around a lot of these works. Some of them don't intend, most of them just don't intend to make sense logically. You're given the license to make your own connections. So I would try to, number one, refrain from trying to say that you get it or not. Number two, I would remember that these artists are trying very hard to sort of fight conventional society. Think about what was happening then, especially in the early 60s, right? We have a civil rights movement emerging. A women's rights movement is emerging after Betty Friedan's book, The Feminine Mystique, comes out in 1963. Not to say there aren't other factors that had already been contributing to mobilizing women, but that book is a kind of a major watershed. Along those lines, with regard to environmentalism, Rachel Carson's book Silent Spring comes out also in the early 60s. And we have a growing war in Vietnam. We have a peace movement. We have a LGBTQ movement emerging. So we have a period of sort of civil rights, women's rights, environmentalism, LGBTQ rights, and anti-war, fueled a lot by youth energy in terms of activism. What does that all symbolize? It symbolizes that the old ways, the old ideals, the old conventions in society are falling away. Interestingly, perhaps we live in a very similar time right now, where a lot of the protests that we see is reflective of ideas that are no longer holding true for people. So this period of the 1960s, we're a little bit in the 70s too, but we're primarily in the 60s this week. I think it's a good way to look at it is that here are all these experiments that are trying to sort of push art beyond the idea of the marketable commodity. and instead use concepts in language as well as the human body in performance, as well as the land itself, outside of the white cube, outside of that gallery environment, to push the idea of what art is, to retain a kind of a conviction with the value of art, and at the same time to try to really push art outside of mainstream convention. So suddenly people like the abstract expressionists and even Warhol seem a little conservative, a little object-based or commodity-based. And you know, when we see people like Yoko Ono allowing people to cut her clothing off in a gallery, or Marina Abramovic actually succumbing to physical violence in where people are invited to participate in a way to violate her body, it says a lot about power and violence in our culture. Then again, we have people like Bruce Nauman engaging in more sort of mundane aspects of what the human body does, or even Andy Goldsworthy, looking at the environment in very poetic and sort of magical ways in the way he reconfigures the natural world. So enjoy this week with I would try to reserve the feeling that you have to understand this work completely, and instead look at it as an impulse that tries to further, push with the idea of what avant-garde art is, that pushes past the idea of the object as an artwork, that tries to reintegrate art in life, and tries to challenge conventional mainstream society, very much in the spirit of all of the activism that is common in the 1960s. So if you have any questions, of course, let me know. I'm a little bit behind in looking at your written work. I'm catching up. And as always, if you have any questions, shoot me an email, and I'm always here to help. So take care and have a good week.